these riots?
A state of emergency takes hold after a night of rioting.
Detroit, Ferguson, Watts.
Yup. Arson, looting, general chaos and violence. You know, riots.
But what do we call something like this? After the San Francisco Giants won the World Series in 2014, their fans started fires, vandalized cars, and stopped traffic. Despite the violence and property damage, this was dubbed a celebration, not a riot.
Really? It was? Huh. But what about... Or do those headlines not count because they don't fit your narrative?
But when people hit the streets over police brutality and systemic racism, we're quick to use the R word.
I'm not sure what to tell you. A riot is a riot, whatever the supposed motivation. Unless you're planning on making excuses for riots that you approve of. But no, I'm sure a reputable outlet like Fusion, I mean like Splinter, would never do that.
The Oxford Dictionary defines riot as a violent disturbance of the peace by a crowd.
That is a fair definition. I agree with that definition. Now, let us all remember that definition as we proceed.
But what do you call it when there wasn't peace to begin with?
When there wasn't peace to begin with? So, prior to those riots, the buildings and cars were already on fire, the looting and violence were already taking place. What are you talking about?
When people took to the streets to call attention to the lack of peace.
So, burning cars and buildings, looting and destroying, assaulting and injuring people, these are acts meant to call attention to the lack of peace. Got it.
We've been calling violent uprisings against the government riots for generations.
Violent uprisings against the government. Detroit, Ferguson, and Watts, they weren't riots, they were violent uprisings against the government. They were not at all violent disturbances of the peace by a crowd. You know, the definition of a riot. Wow, I am learning something new every day.
Those Giants fans, on the other hand, had nothing to fight for, and were largely a drunk mess.
Yes, as long as you have something to fight for, then a riot isn't really a riot. It's a, violent uprising against the government. A completely noble and justified action. Well, I am sure that this correction in terms will unburn the businesses, return all of the stolen goods, and heal all of the injuries that take place during that take place during a violent uprising against the government.
But in the past century, when majority black and brown communities rose up against police violence and discrimination, we started calling them riots.
Rising up against police violence involves setting civilian cars on fire. And this, of course, does not at all fall within the definition of a riot. Got it.
We're talking about the aftermath of Rodney King, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, and the 1967 raid of the Blind Pig in Detroit.
Yes, the aftermaths of which all evolved into riots.
They resulted in over $1 billion worth of damages and took hundreds of lives. Looking at images like these, there's no doubt we're seeing disorder and destruction and riot police.
So again, you've just laid out everything that overwhelmingly defines those events as riots. And yet, what is that I hear? just off in the distance. Is that a but?
But before any uprising happened, these communities were beat down for hundreds of years. Without peace to interrupt, we can't accurately call these riots.
Oh, they're just uprisings now. Not violent uprisings against the government, and certainly not riots. They are uprisings. And what differentiates a riot from the morally justifiable uprising is that there must already be peace in place for it to be a riot. Well, let's take a look at the chaos that was Ferguson before the uprising and then after the uprising. Yeah, look at all of those centers of police and government oppression that were risen up against. An auto parts store, a beauty salon, a pizza place, a laundromat. Yeah, that'll teach the government a lesson.
Historically, when an uprising has been a group of white people, you didn't hear riot, you heard rebellion and other code words and euphemisms.
Code words and euphemisms? You mean like uprising? So, if it was okay for racists to cover the violent actions of racists with sugar-coated descriptions, then it's okay to do it when the perpetrators are mostly non-white. Have you ever heard of the phrase, "two wrongs do not make a right"? Can't we all just agree that riots are bad, regardless of the events or intentions that caused them?
But what's the difference between a riot and a rebellion anyway? Let's go back to the dictionary. Rebellion, the action or process of resisting authority, control, or convention.
Is setting cars on fire a resistance of authority? Is smashing windows a resistance against control? Is pulling a man from his truck and beating his head in with a brick a resistance of convention?
Detroit, LA, Ferguson, and Baltimore all sprouted from a pushback by communities against systemic racism and police brutality.
So, again, so long as a given excuse for a riot is one that you agree with, then it is not really a riot and is thus a series of legitimate acts of protest. Got it.
To call these rebellions a riot would mean that they were spontaneous, meaningless eruptions, and that the problem subsided after it was over.
No, you call them riots because they were violent disturbances of the peace by crowds. You know, the definition of a riot.
If a riot is an action that disturbs the peace, a rebellion is a reaction to make peace possible. We'll go with that.
Oh, so riots, sorry, I mean rebellions and uprisings, at least those that you approve of, they are mechanisms for making peace possible. Well, gosh, I'm sure that all of those business owners, all of those car owners, all of those people injured or killed by the rioters, by the rebels, I'm sure that all of those victims will be glad to know that a violent mob decided to make those sacrifices on their behalf to further the cause of peace. Yes, Splinter, I am sure that fixes everything. As always, thank you for watching.